I certainly did know Kyle. Now, you asked the question, did I know Kyle personally? And I think I knew Kyle in a church calling. He was the counselor. I think he was the first counselor. And I was I believe, first counselor in the Young Women organization. Kyle was a man that had a zest for living. He was just an incredible, dynamic individual who seemed to be able to know and have a relationship with a lot of people, and particularly in the church. I found out later on that he had a tremendous impact on people outside of the church, but in the church and in our ward, he was just an incredible individual. He was not, he was rather small, and he was a nice-looking man, but he wasn't Don Juan kind of a man. He was just a really neat individual. And really first getting to know him was as in my calling. And I really was quite new in the church. I believe it was about 4 years, that we had been members of the church. And I'd always worked in the Young Women's organization, and I had been called to be a counselor. But there were a lot of questions that I had about the church, and a lot of times that I wasn't sure of some of the things I was doing. So I used to go to Kyle and talk to him, and he'd grab a room and he'd pull me in the room and sit down and say, okay, ask away, fire away. And he would he would answer these questions that I had, and they might be gospel oriented, they might be just simple things. Well, he did that with everybody. It wasn't just with me. It's just the type of person he was. But yes, you're right. Kyle made me feel very special. He made everyone feel very special. And he had a unique way of making each person feel like their individual problem was something that was meaningful to him, and something that he was concerned about and would like to help you with if he could. Watching him with our young women, and of course that's where my first contact was just incredible. He had a way of touching each of the girls, and at the time we had several sons who had not only joined the church, and they had this long hair, but they were kind of thought they were cool. And they weren't sure that the church was the place that they were going to feel this great comfort. And Kyle came into their lives, and if they were, I think, not surfing, skateboarding was the big thing then. Well, Kyle was out there on a skateboard with everyone, and he would do the same, if they were doing it, and he took a bad tumble and ended up in the hospital and had to have surgery on his knee. But he was that kind of an individual. He just had this enthusiasm for living, and he had great enthusiasm for the young people that were in his charge. He had the physical energy, of course, which was wonderful because he could keep up with all the young people. But he also had tremendous spiritual energy. And he absolutely loved the gospel. He was not afraid to share it with anyone. And my particular sons were very challenging. And he came in, in working with young men that hadn't been in the church very long. There were a lot of things, background that we didn't have. And Kyle just befriended each one of them. And it's amazing to me that he found a way to touch each of them so that they just thought he was about the coolest thing that ever happened. I think that if you could interview them today, they would remember him and remember him well, because he was just, he just had that kind of spirituality that so many people would like to have. But it's not something that you just manufacture. It was really a part of him. I also want to say how much he loved his family. He just could not wait until his children were teenagers so that he could be out there playing with them, and he totally planned to be able to do that and hoped to be able to do that. It's amazing. There was just something about Kyle that was different from other people, and I can't quite put a finger on what it is. There are a lot of people that are spiritual. A lot of people serve very, very happily and very gratefully. But there was just something in, and maybe it was, part of it was a time in my life when I was learning about the church and growing myself, and there was that enthusiasm. There was that connection that he had with people. He just connected with you, and once he connected with you, it wasn't because of who he was. Like I won't call him charismatic in the way that, some people draw your attention and just keep your attention. There was just something about the way he made you feel, and maybe the importance that he gave to the other person. I have no question that that's part of what his talent was, and it was truly a talent to be able to convey how he felt about people so well. Oh, far. I felt far more than anyone that I've known in these last 27 years. There's not one that I could tell you that I remember so clearly what happened at the time. I'll tell you, when I learned that he died, I can remember going into the bathroom and just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing and asking the Lord, why? Why was this man taken? Such a good man, a man that made such an impact on so many people, just within our ward. And it's interesting that I don't know that I got the answer that night, but it was the first time since I'd been a member of the church that something so devastating had happened, and I just couldn't understand. And he wasn't there to ask that question, that I had always thought I could go and ask him before. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And he didn't take a lot of time. It wasn't that he spent a lot of time with anybody. You just knew you could ask him. You knew you could ask him and he'd have the answer. And I thought it was so unfair for him to be taken so suddenly. And it was it was a trial time in my own testimony, to learn that there could actually be more work that was required of him on the other side than I thought was required of him here, right here on earth. Karen felt probably the same way at that time. Well, we wanted to reassure her. We wanted to reassure Karen that there was a greater work for him to do. But it was hard for us because he was such a dynamic personality. And it's really hard to explain to you because you didn't meet him and didn't know him. Oh, maybe I shouldn't be saying that. your voice won't be heard. But anyway, it would be hard to explain to someone who didn't know him how such an unassuming person could be so dynamic. I mean, this was not a man with a big ego. This was just a very warm, outgoing, let's have fun, but let's remember that we're members of the church, and we grow together, learn together, and it was. Am I right about that? He was just a very special individual, and I think that's what set him apart, because there really was no way that he was trying to impress someone. I mean, there was no way that he was trying to, make some place for himself in the church or anything. It was completely and totally love, and he loved his family just as much, and he talked about his family. I can't wait. Oh, I just can't wait till they can do this and they can do that. And I want to make note, because you'll probably be asked this at some point. Karen always said, I take care of the babies. I know how to take care of the babies, and I'm really good at this, early life stages. But when they become teenagers, Kyle is going to have them, 100% of them. He's going to be the one that, puts his foot down. And I mean, it was really neat, because she always felt that, of course, that he was going to be there, but that he would have, this relationship that she could obviously see, with the youth in the ward. It's interesting. I usually went to the activities that they had, because our young women's president was younger than I was, and had young children, and felt that she couldn't go to the activities. So we went to Catalina. There are a number of places that we went over the years, and usually I went with the group. And I always volunteered to, because I had children, that age, and wanted to be there. But that year, for whatever reason, I can't remember the reason, I didn't go, and the president went. And I would have liked to have been there on just one level, because I understand it was an extremely spiritual experience for those that were there, particularly the adults that were there. And but I'm very grateful that I was spared that time, because I really wasn't prepared. As I mentioned before, I was very upset, and I don't know how I would have handled it with the young women. It really made me realize I had a lot more to understand about the gospel. I believe it was Bill Ruffner, who was our home teacher, and called us quite early, in the early morning hours, and said that he had heard that there had been an accident, and that Kyle had drowned. And I was just so completely, as I said before, I can imagine many homes in the ward were feeling the same thing, and of course wondering how the people were that were there at the time, those that had gone, how they were dealing with it. I understand that Bishop Berger worked over him for quite a long period of time, and I know the Lord, it was his time to leave, because with all the priesthood that was there, they might have revived him, but maybe Kyle would not have been the person that he was had he been revived. Had the power of the priesthood been that called upon in that way, and my feelings are that it was his time. No, well, it wasn't. It's not. That isn't amazing at all. Um, so many times since this has happened, Kyle has come up for any number of reasons. And that's what's amazing, is how many times he comes up in my memory, and he comes up in the memory of my children, and he comes up in the memory of other people, and my husband, and people that were present back at that time. And as we talk about him, we completely can bring him right up to now. You know, it's not something that's hazy and that's in the past. And when you know, hearing that it's been 27 years, although I just recently went over and looked at his foot, you know, his stone over in the cemetery, it's hard to believe that 27 years has gone by, because his memory is still so alive. And I don't know, I can't tell you why his is, and so many people who have gone, you know, passed away in early in life haven't. Well, let me comment about the funeral, because that was something new for me. I hadn't been to a lot of LDS funerals, and what they did, and I don't know who made the decision to do it, was to have all the young people in the ward come in wearing white shirts and dark pants, all the boys, all the priesthood, and I believe the girls wore white blouses. And they sat along the side rows. And that was an incredible experience, because a lot of children came to the funeral. And the building was filled to capacity. There was standing room only. I believe there were at least 2,000 people there. This is not a man that was just known in his ward. Every place he went, he made a lasting impression. And many people came from his company, from his work site. It was an amazing thing just to be there and experience that funeral, and to realize for the first time, here he's gone, to realize what an incredible impact he had on so many people, and how many people just wanted to be there to pay their respects for him. Again, this is not a man that is in a high station in life. This is not a man with, you know, that was wealthy or highly placed in the church or anything. Here was the man that was in the bishopric, who was in his 30s, I believe, 33. And yet he had touched so many people. I've never seen it before, quite like this. We were together in the ward. I didn't really know Karen very well, and because he was in the calling with me, and I was new in the church, so most of the people I knew were in the Young Women's Organization. But when this happened, I felt compelled to go to Karen, and you know, soon after Kyle passed away, to go, you know, and call her, and I invited her to go out and we had some yogurt together, And we did this on several occasions. We just got together and talked about Kyle. And I learned so much more about him. I mean, I thought I would know it all, seeing all the people that were at his funeral. But the most amazing thing of all is the impact he had on his own family. And you just feel like, you know, a person that is a people person that everyone likes and everyone respects and everyone wants to be, you know, part of knowing him and being around him and being associated with him, that surely his wife would be the one that didn't, you know, have the quality of time and everything. But that wasn't true. She had an absolutely amazing relationship with him. And, you know, at one time I tried to console her with, very foolishly, by saying, someday, when the time's right, someone will come along. You're a very young woman, and you just have young children, a newborn baby. You know, eventually someone will come along. And she didn't disagree with me. 27 years later, and she's never found that somebody, because she's still married to Kyle, and she has an eternal marriage. So she didn't need to find another man, and there isn't another man that would have replaced him. So she didn't. The things that I learned about Karen after Kyle died, I could then understand, you know, how completely supportive she was of him and everything that he did, how much she looked forward to him being there to be able to help them when the children were in their teenage years, how fearful she was of trying to do that alone, and how faithful she was, because she's enormously faithful. I just, at the time, I couldn't imagine. That's why I came close to her, because I wanted to try to understand. And being so new in the gospel, I couldn't imagine doing it by myself. I mean, over the years watching her, and we've been in different wards, so we haven't been as close. But she taught Sydney piano for several years, and just being close to her and, you know, just knowing her and watching the way she has handled everything in her life. I can't really talk about each of the children and her relationship with them, because she was, you know, in another ward, in another state, I believe, right? So that I didn't see the day-to-day things that were happening, but we did go to Cammie's wedding, and we had an opportunity to touch bases with her, you know, and the family again, and see them in action. And all I could think of was, she did this. She had to put one foot ahead of the other for her children. She had to continue to develop her own spirituality and her own faith. She had to resolve the problems the feelings that she felt about losing Kyle so suddenly and so unexpectedly. And she did it. And she did it without that, you know, terrible, poor me, oh, my life is so hard, oh, my life is so sad. I can never remember hearing that from her at all. It was, I want to live so that I can be worthy to be with Kyle again, and our family can be with him again. You know, not really, not really. And that, of course, you know, in terrible grief. And that was something that you could feel. That's something that you could see in her face and in her eyes. But no, I would never say that she was complaining about her lot in life. She said, you know, she had, with Kyle, had more than many people would ever have living together a whole lifetime. And I won't say she was happy that he was gone, because she wasn't, but she wanted to live her life and wanted her children to know that they needed to live their life so that they could return and be a family again with their father. I've had a couple of personal, one in particular that stands out very, very much at the time that Kyle died, and one that I had with my son, who was very skeptical about the church, and Kyle was working with pretty much, every time he came, he worked with him. Let me tell you about my experience, because it was, it's one of those things that you don't expect to happen. You're not looking for it to happen. But Kyle died March 17th, and on June 15th, Duncan and I went to my husband and I went to the temple to be sealed to each other. And since we had a blended family, we have children from both sides. We weren't able to be sealed to them that day, but we were sealed to each other. And there was another couple, and there was the sister that was also taking out her endowments. And we went through the endowment session, and then we went into the sealing room. And when we were in the sealing room, and I looked around, because there were almost 75 people there. It was amazing. The people were just lined up. They were stacked. And as I looked at Bishop Berger, and I looked beyond, I saw Kyle, and then I saw, I guess it was Bishop Warnick or someone else. And immediately I said, "That's not Kyle." I went back, and it was someone strange that was not even someone that I knew, that was standing next to Bishop Berger. I saw Kyle. I saw Kyle. I've never forgotten it. I mean, it was such a powerful thing. And I knew he was there with us. I just knew that he was there with us. And I shared that with Karen after, that it was just such an incredible thing to see him. Just for that second. I mean, I just went right by them, and they were all standing there. And then my mind said, "Wait a minute, that can't be Kyle," and I went back, and it wasn't. So I feel that for that brief instant, he was there. He was letting me know that he was there. And I wasn't, as they say, I wasn't prepared. I'd never had a spiritual experience like that. I mean, it was, yeah, but it happened. And I felt certain it happened. Our children were teenagers. They were 13, 14, 15, kind of rebellious ages. And one son came downstairs one day shortly after Kyle died, and he said to me, "Boy, I had a dream last night. But it was so real. I know it was a dream, but it felt so real." And he said, and it was about Kyle Hess. And so I stopped, and I listened carefully, and I waited for him to go on, and he said, "Kyle, I was walking with a boy, another friend somewhere. I don't remember where, but there were two of us, and we were walking together." And he said, "Kyle came out of a building and pointed at me and said, 'Get your life in order.'" And he said, and I started saying, no, no, stay away from me, you're dead. And he said, he kept coming closer to me, and he said, get your life in order. And he said, I didn't know what to do. He said, I ran screaming away from him. He said, what do you think that meant? He said, you know, I know there are a lot of things that I'm not doing, maybe I'm supposed to be doing right now. But he said, it just felt so much more like more than a dream. It just felt like he was telling me I needed to get my life in order. Now, I want to tell you that this boy never did embrace the gospel, his son. And I don't think that, you know, the time is past or ever will be past. Will never be too late for him to. But I do feel that Kyle was reaching out to him in the only way that he could was to tell him, you need to get your life in order. And his life is in order as far as, you know, living a good life and having a fine family. And I mean, he's a fine son. But he didn't get his gospel life in order. And I feel like that was the thing that Kyle was attempting to do, even from beyond the veil. And of course, when we talked about it later on, he says, oh, now you know it was just a dream. I said, but you did remember it to feel like so much more than a dream. And he said, well, yeah, it did. But it really was only a dream because, you see, he had to take away that feeling that he had and that fear that he had, that he really was going astray. So, you know, I don't know, that's something that, you know, for each of our children, Kyle had an enormous impact on them. He had an enormous impact. And I suspect that when we get to the other side, Kyle will be there. I think he'll be there, and he'll be there even for those of our family who didn't embrace the church because they didn't have an understanding, even though he tried to help them. So maybe he'll be there to help them further understand it. And maybe that's what he's doing and why he was called away so unexpectedly. He's just one in a million. And I think we all should try harder to be more like him, to live our lives the way he did. It was such a simple thing to do, you know? It was such a simple thing. He didn't know he was going to be called away so suddenly. And he just enjoyed every day. He enjoyed it. He appreciated it. He found joy in his calling. He found great love in his family. And he loved his brothers and sisters in the gospel so much. And I'm just so grateful to have a Kyle Hess in my background and in my life. And I can only say that I hope that I'll be worthy to be able to see him again. And I know he's going to have lots of people wanting to see him. Lots and lots of people. Yeah. And his children most of all. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, not really. I think Joyce has said it all, but Kyle came into our lives at a point in time where we were in the church maybe 3 years or less, still wondering what we got ourselves into. Why did we? Some of the kids said, "Why did we do this?" It was kind of a bit of a turmoil. We had testimonies in the embryonic stage, but they were growing. Well, Kyle, when he came into the bishopric, it was he wasn't your. if you're a non-Mormon, not a member of the church for 30-some years, 35 years, you have a stereotype, incorrectly, but you have a stereotype of what a Mormon is. He wasn't that. He was just a great guy. He was dynamic. He was effervescent. And he was spiritual. Now, I would have told you when I was 30 that you couldn't be those things. But he was. And he was right in the thick of things with the kids. He was in Vegas, and he fouled up his, I think it was his ankle. Joyce said knee, but I think it was his ankle. Whatever it was, he had pins and everything. On a skateboard, riding a skateboard. But when he was up on the stand and when he spoke, he was a spiritual man, and he touched people. And it was obvious not just to me, but to everybody. So his death was a shock. It was a shock. I was personally probably just barely beyond the point where I would have been very angry as to why. I didn't ask the questions why, because some years prior, probably a year after we joined the church in 1976, there was a young man who was President Starr's son, who just came back from his mission, was up at BYU driving home with his fiancée to have his family meet him, and he was killed. They were both killed in an automobile accident. And I was working in the landscape business at the time and talked to another guy who was on the same job. And I said, how could this possibly happen? How could this possibly happen? This can't be. Why? And all he did was look at me and say, well, you just really don't understand the church yet. Well, by the time Kyle had died, I did have a level of understanding that I wasn't terribly angry and so forth. I'm sure Karen was angry. She had to be angry. She probably experienced all levels of emotion. But he had an impact on one of our kids worked for him. And he'll tell you to this day. One thing I learned is I don't want to be in the insulation business. But he'll talk about Kyle, and he was a wonderful guy to work for. He knew him in a work setting. And you heard about Chris, who had this experience with having Kyle come to him in a dream. Why we're 29 years, 27 years later, why are we talking about Kyle Hess? I mean, isn't it interesting that we're talking about Kyle Hess, that you're putting together this documentary? This may be a first. I don't know. I mean, 20 some years later, he has in church today. We had in primary we had a lesson that talked about examples that every time you say or do something, you're impacting somebody somehow. Well, Kyle Hess carried that concept to the nth degree, and it was always a positive impact. The kids loved him. If they were alive, they'd be out bungee jumping or something with the kids. So I can't add much to what Joyce has said other than that, he did have truly an eternal impact on people.
You didn't have that same experience.
No, I did not.
But you saw, I don't know, that's a while ago. I don't know if you remember all that detail.
I remember Joyce talking about it,
Right.
certainly, and I didn't question it at the time. I had enough of a knowledge of the church and of spiritual experiences. Yeah, 2 years before, I would have said, "Oh, that's crazy. That's crazy." As you and I had a discussion today, I don't question any of these things at all. I didn't know personally. No, I didn't know him personally. I feel I know a lot of people in church when you're in a church setting, but personally or socially, no, we didn't socialize with the Hesses. It was strictly in a church setting, but he was the kind of a man that when you're new in the church, relatively new in the church, and you see a guy like this, and he's younger than I was at the time, by several years. And here was a man to look up to. Now, at that age, in 20s and 30s, you look up to people who are older. But here's the guy, I was 37 or 38 when I first, 36 or 7 when I first met him. And he was in his early 30s. And here's the guy I looked up to. Here's a guy that's, you know, that really has it all together, gospel-wise, and every other way as well. I mean, it's when you're 36 years old, and you see guys like Kyle Hess and Bob Warnick, and you look up to them, and these are young kids. You know, at that age, 5-6 years is a long time difference. It isn't when you're my age or even in your 40s and 50s, but when you're in your 30s, when you're 5 years younger than somebody, that's quite a bit younger. Impactful was Karen Hess. A lot of us have been here for all the years since Kyle passed away. And we've all watched Karen, some from close up, some from distances. We were not in the same ward shortly after that. I think the Lake Forest ward then encompassed what is now the Santa Margarita Stake. So shortly after that, they created another ward and so forth. But we watched Karen. Everybody watched Karen. As a convert, I particularly wondered, well, how is she going to handle this? I mean, here she is, all these kids and pregnant, and her husband was gone. I mean, that's enough to really tick somebody off, to put it bluntly. And so her example of how she rose to the occasion, so to speak, to use a cliche. But of course, it's because of the gospel and because of the eternal perspective. But as a new convert, we didn't fully understand this eternal perspective stuff. So it sounds great. You know, it reads well. And it sounds great, like I said. But here it is in action with Karen Hess. So that was equally important, I think, impactful.